When I first asked that question, I wasn't expecting the most exciting answer. Certainly wasn't thinking there would be a video that I could tell a really good story in, and yet here we are asking the question, how exactly did the people that built Hillforts build Hillforts? A couple of antler picks, some rudimentary wooden shovels, everyone get digging and we'll be done within a couple of weeks. But it turns out it wasn't quite that simple, and the adventure that I've been on to try and uncover how we used to build Hillforts in the Iron Age is one of the most learning-filled journeys I've been on to date, and certainly a story worth sharing with you. This is gold. This really was quite the journey. The deeper I delved into this, the more I realised that building a Hillfort wasn't just about shifting dirt. These people were engineers. They used techniques I really didn't expect to learn about and probably wouldn't be too out of place today with their principles. This was about strategy, survival, community, shaping the earth and creating a symbol of power, crafting something that would stand for over 2,000 years. Today I learned how to build a Hillfort. It was far more ingenious and challenging and surprising than I ever expected. Welcome to the story of how we built Hillforts. That's really good. So my immediate thought was a Hillfort along this ridge here. I think I'm in East Berkshire, if not sort of North Hampshire. Now it's referred to as Ladle Hill, and it's just up ahead. There's a specific reason I thought this would be quite useful to help us on our quest today, but you really need to see it to believe it. Ladle Hillfort sits on a ridge steeped with eras of history. It's a Hillfort that nestles itself between Bronze Age barrows, supposed Roman bits, and it was even thought to be a Neolithic causewayed enclosure. Likely the namesake comes from Anglo-Saxon charters, which describe it as the camp of the pond, because it even had a dew pond. Now here's the important part. In 1931, a man named Stuart Piggott came here on the basis of a aerial photograph he'd seen, and he declared that it was not a Neolithic causewayed enclosure, it was in fact an unfinished Hillfort. Allow me to explain via a series of unique features. So first of all, I'm walking in a Bronze Age boundary ditch, much earlier than the Hillforts that we see on the landscape today. And this boundary ditch I'm walking in right now goes for miles in that direction, all the way down the valley, down to the road and further south to some Bronze Age barrows, I believe. Piggott suggested that there was one of these either side of the Hillfort, and this one on the west side, well, this one was used by these Iron Age people to mark the top, the northwest and the northern side of that Hillfort, almost like they were using it to mark the Hillfort out. Okay, secondly, and here's where this gets juicy, we've got the classic Hillfort structure. We've got the bank and we've got the ditch there, but if we go forward about 10 foot or so in front of me and we stand up here, well, the bank and ditch just disappear. That's too much for this to just be a gate, because there's quite a few of these around here. And if we go to about here and we get down to foot level, things get better, because all of a sudden we've got a slight ditch here, and that goes all the way round on these flatter bits. This is now referred to as a setting out ditch, and this would have been all the way around here just before they started this Hillfort to tell them where exactly they wanted it. This is gold, but it gets better. On the inside, Piggott noticed spoil heaps from the ditch. So you might be thinking, like I did, why wasn't the bank just made from the spoil from the ditch? That seems really obvious and sensible, but they didn't do that. The spoil was removed from the ditch and placed on the inside here. But why? So Piggott suggested that as you dug deeper into this ditch here, well, you'd find really big chalk boulders, and they were essential for the start of the rampart, the start of the bank there. Because if you then took all of the topsoil off first, you placed that over there in the middle somewhere to get out of the way, then you put your boulders down first, well, that would give a really firm base to your bank. You would then put the soil back on top and firm it all up. But there was one problem. Have a look at this. So here at Ladle, that simply didn't happen all the way around. Right now I'm stood on a bit that doesn't really have a bank, it has a ditch, but we have loads of spoil heaps here on the inside, well away from the inside of the what would have been the bank. We have lots of unfinished bits where they didn't get round to digging for whatever reason, so this gives us a really good idea of how they started to build and lay out and then plan and construct a Hillfort. This is a great start, but what exactly is next? Just up ahead is Alfred's Castle Hillfort, and I brought you here to show you its very interesting purpose, which will help today's story. Now, I would say that Alfred's Castle is unique, but then I guess any Hillfort, really, when you scratch the surface and you look at the archaeology that's been done on it, well, they all offer up these wonderful stories and all sort of seem to tell their own story in a unique way. This is East Berkshire. We're a mile or so from the Ridgeway, and oddly we're not really on the highest local point. We have a huge ridge to the northeast. In fact, this could even be said to be on the side of this hill. So is this even a Hillfort? Well, yes it is, because, and here's a huge sweeping statement, when the early antiquarians all came along and started doing early archaeology, they deemed that everything was military and, for this, well, fort-like. And to be fair, it was a well-defended site, but its location can tell us a lot more about the society here. So first up, we have the classic ditch and bank system of a Hillfort. Historic England suggests that it was lined with sarsen stones all around its outside. Adds up because down in the valley there's a lot of sarsen stones sort of occurring naturally in the landscape there, and I've spotted maybe 2 so far in what was probably their original position. Now, we do also know that there was a building on the inside of this. Now, we don't know exactly if that was contemporary with the original construction of the Hillfort, but it's certainly not recent. Add to that its shape, polygonal. Again, that's a first for me. Now, the combination of all of these factors I've mentioned tells us one really important thing. This Hillfort, which started out as a late Bronze Age enclosure, likely turned into what we see today in the Middle Iron Age, and it was in fact here to protect a farmstead. For sure, this wasn't the first enclosure or Hillfort that we know of that did just that. But it does tell us one huge thing about this place. We need a huge society to build this. It wasn't just a monumental piece of earthwork manoeuvring. Bear in mind, this was lined with sarsens all the way around its circumference. So this might not be up there on everyone's list of really important answers to the question, how do we build a Hillfort? But for me, the society aspect is huge, because take this relatively small Hillfort built to protect this small farmstead. Well, it doesn't compare at all to the likes of the Maiden Castles, the Daneburys, the Cissbury Rings, all of those huge ones. This is tiny compared to that, but that highlights the point, because think of the man hours needed to plan this, to build this, to move the earth, to get the sarsens from perhaps down in the valley and line the entire circumference with them. That's a huge amount of time, preparation and organising of society. So for me, that aspect of society is really important when we ask the question of how to build a Hillfort. What's next? Okay, I promise you the good stuff. Let's get to the nuts and bolts. Now, speaking of Danebury, here we are in this wonderful gated entranceway. Now, I often use Danebury as a backdrop because it's a very beautiful place, but today it holds a very specific and quite useful purpose for this video. From the 1960s to the 1980s, this site would have looked very different. Barry Cunliffe and his team excavated this site like nothing before. Probably half of the main central area was dug out, plus a number of the ramparts, and that gave us a huge insight into exactly how you build a Hillfort. So let's do that. How did we build this Hillfort? The first thing that Barry Cunliffe did when he came here in 1969 is establish that there were some linear ditches around this area. That reminds us very much of Ladle Hill, and he goes on to suggest that between 1000 BC and 600 BC, a certain change in society led all of these local polities to start building a more secure earthwork, and thus they did just that, and they dug here, and we have the first of these, a ditch built by the early Iron Age. Phase 1 or period 1 was built on ground level, and we would have seen timber fronted ramparts in the form of a box. Now, the first phase of this construction was to build the bank using chalk from the ditch, but Cunliffe highlights that there was a backed up clay lined soil also from the ditch, which was stockpiled on the inside first. Now, does that sound like anything we've seen in this video already? Now, the back of that bank, the inside of it, well, that started to erode down a bit over the years, and that was once again shored up, and on top of the bank, well, we added another metre metre or so in height. The ramparts by this time are sort of, let's say, rotted away quite some significant amount, and this was said to be around about 50 years after this was first built, this bank and ditch here at Danebury. Well, then we move on one more phase and we see a little bit of construction here on the south side, but a lot more earthworks on the north side with regards to raising its inner bank. Now that was a bit confusing at first, but our hero of the day, Barry Cunliffe, suggests that, well, that just levelled out the entire earthworks of this hill fort, making it nice and symmetrical, and that would have been after 50 years at some point. But for me, that's not the most fascinating part. Come and have a look at this. So we have the inner bank protecting the inside where people lived and worked, did whatever, and we have the outer bank, often called the counterscarp. Now Barry Cunliffe suggested that you would always be taking out the silt and debris and leaves and all sorts that was in here, and you'd be chucking it that way. You'd be chucking it on the outside on the counterscarp. Now he suggests that the word counterscarp is wrong because that implies a deliberate military fortification, a deliberate purpose, but he suggests that that wasn't there for that reason. That has no integrity to its structure. It's just all the rubbish from here chucked over there. This was just a nice plus point from just clearing out all of this in the middle, according to Barry Cunliffe. Now Danebury does hold a really interesting story with its gates back at the front there. Quite a complex one, that'll be a story for another day, but for the meantime there's one more thing to consider here that Danebury highlights really well. I just need to find myself a good vantage point just up ahead. So do you remember the diagram from the ramparts? We saw a wooden box structure on top. Danebury is big, like really big. I think it's really important to highlight that the construction requirements of this entire site go way beyond this perimeter. And I don't just mean a bunch of trees, but let's have a quick talk on that. So let's talk about timber, because that'll give us some grounding and understanding to this. And Barry Cunliffe suggested that initial phase 1 to build the ramparts up there, well, that would take 4,000 timbers, all sort of 5 meters long, significant size. And it wasn't just to build the rampart on the outside themselves, that was to build the entire box section, the cross braces and everything needed to build that and shore it up. So Danebury is 5 hectares in size. Now there are estimations to suggest that an area the size of 95 hectares would need to be cleared to cover the site of Danebury. Well, who controlled that land? The labourers couldn't just rock up and steal what they wanted. This would imply a significant social cohesion, and of course those labourers, well, they would need food, water, all kinds of sustenance to keep them going. So in this early part of the Iron Age, when we see these huge earthworks in the form of hill forts that we see them today start to prop up everywhere, well, what does it tell us about society? Does it tell us that all of these people from around here would be willing to help build this? And why would they be willing to help? Were they perhaps offered a share of resources, a share of the community and the sense of community, the show of wealth? Were they perhaps offered protection in the future of their farmsteads if they would help build this? Perhaps Niall Sharples puts it more eloquently than I ever could. If we regard the construction process as related to the gift of labour and resources, then construction of even larger and more complicated enclosure boundaries is effectively the conspicuous consumption of resources. Communities were in competition to attract larger and larger numbers of people to help in the process of construction. So these ramparts that sit behind me are 2,500 years old. The earthworks just there, and they're still here for us today, like so many others around the country and beyond, and they still allow us to sort of try and conjecture and understand them today. That period, sort of 600 BC and onwards, probably represents a huge time of change in the society, a huge time of hardship and strain upon these communities. And we're probably not talking about the larger scale of the late Iron Age tribes, the Dubunni, the Atrebates, the Durotriggers. We're probably talking about much smaller communities, whatever reason, forced to build these earthworks and fortifications to protect whatever it was they were protecting, whether it was their homes and resources or marketplaces, trading places, you name it. But for me, there is no other way to appreciate every aspect of this, every aspect of what we've talked about today, the labour, the society, the resources, the organisation and the sheer physical toll, than to stand here now. I need to start savouring things a tad more, because I sometimes rush from place to place, tell a story and then leave. And whilst I never want to go in the opposite direction and over-romanticise an era that we know relatively little about, I do like the idea of trying to tell a story through the people that lived here and that struggled here and fought here, and that probably stood on exactly the same spot that I am right now, and maybe contemplated the small but hugely important stuff as well. What came before?